Here's a fact that surprises most people. The bone in your body right now is a living, constantly rebuilding material, not the dry, dead-looking thing you might picture from a skeleton model. And understanding what it's actually made of is the key to understanding why it sometimes shatters and sometimes just bends. Before we get into the physics, let's clear up what bone actually is. It's a composite material, meaning it's built from more than one ingredient working together, roughly 2/3 hard mineral, about a quarter flexible protein, and a bit of water woven through both. Here's the physics question we're actually answering today. Why does a bone that can support your entire body weight during a run suddenly shatter in a fall? The short answer is that it isn't really about strength at all, it's about speed. Every impact follows the same basic physics chain. Your body is moving with kinetic energy. That motion suddenly stops. The energy has to go somewhere, and your bones absorb a share of it as mechanical stress. Whether that stress bends the bone safely or breaks it depends on exactly how fast that energy gets dumped in. A few numbers to anchor us before we dig in. Adult cortical bone, the dense outer shell of your bones, typically has a stiffness, or Young's modulus, around 15 to 20 gigapascals, and can withstand roughly 100 to 200 megapascals of compressive stress before failing. Those numbers will matter once we start changing the speed of loading. It helps to compare bone to materials engineers actually understand well. Pure hydroxyapatite mineral, on its own, is stiff but shatters like glass. Pure collagen protein, on its own, is flexible but far too weak to hold up your skeleton. Combined, bone lands somewhere far tougher than either ingredient alone, which is the whole trick. So let's break down that recipe, starting with the two main ingredients. Bone is a living composite, not a single hard substance, and its fracture behavior is driven as much by the speed of an impact as by raw strength. Keep both ideas in mind as we go deeper. Engineers have a favorite analogy for bone, and it's one you've probably seen in real life: reinforced concrete. The mineral part of bone is called hydroxyapatite, a crystal made of calcium and phosphate. These crystals are microscopic, just a few nanometers thick, but they're packed by the billions throughout your skeleton, and they're what give bone its hardness and rigidity. In the concrete analogy, hydroxyapatite plays the role of the gravel and cement, providing hardness and compressive strength, but on its own being brittle and crack-prone. Collagen plays the role of the steel rebar, providing tensile strength and the ability to flex without snapping. By weight, a typical adult bone breaks down to roughly 65% mineral, about 25% collagen protein, and the remaining 10% water, woven through the structure at a nanoscale level so intimately that you can't actually separate the two components without destroying the material's properties. This composite structure isn't uniform throughout a bone, either. The dense outer shell, called cortical bone, is where most of this mineral collagen composite does its heavy lifting. Inside, a honeycomb-like lattice called trabecular bone adds strength, while keeping the whole structure lightweight enough for you to move around. Here's the part that actually explains the toughness. Mineral and collagen aren't just mixed together. They're mechanically interlocked at the nanoscale, with hydroxyapatite crystals embedded directly inside and around the collagen fibers. That intimate overlap is what lets stress get shared between a stiff component and a flexible one instead of concentrating in just one. Zoom out far enough, and bone structure looks like a set of nested building blocks, each scale adding its own trick for handling stress. Mineral crystals sit inside collagen fibrils. Fibrils bundle into fibers. Fibers wrap into osteons. And osteons stack up into the whole bone you'd recognize on an X-ray. Bone gets its unusual mix of hardness and toughness from combining a brittle mineral with a flexible protein, interlocked at the nanoscale, exactly like rebar inside concrete. Every material, including bone, has a story it tells as you push on it harder and harder, and that story is called a stress-strain curve. Push on bone gently, and it deforms elastically, meaning it springs right back to its original shape once you let go, just like a bent ruler. Push harder, past what's called the yield point, and the deformation becomes permanent. Push harder still, and you hit the fracture point, where the bone finally gives way. Walking through that curve stage by stage. First, the collagen network stretches, and the whole structure flexes elastically. Next, at the yield point, microscopic damage starts accumulating faster than it can be absorbed. Finally, the mineral matrix, which can't stretch nearly as much as collagen, reaches its limit and cracks propagate through to complete fracture. Cortical bone typically fractures at somewhere around 1.5 to 3% strain, meaning it can only stretch that tiny percentage of its original length before something has to give. For comparison, a rubber band can stretch several 100% before failing, which tells you just how limited bone's flexibility actually is. Here's the division of labor during that stretch. Early on, the collagen network is doing most of the deforming, gradually straightening and sliding. Only later, once the collagen slack is used up, does the stiffer mineral matrix start carrying the bulk of the load and approaching its own breaking point. Now bring in kinetic energy. The faster a moving body decelerates, the more force gets delivered to the bone in a shorter window of time, and force concentrated into a shorter time window is exactly what pushes a bone from safely bending toward that fracture point on the curve. Quick pause before the core physics reveal. Everything we've covered so far, elastic bending, yield, fracture, happens differently depending on how fast the load is applied, which is exactly what we're covering next. If this is clicking for you, subscribing helps more of this reach you. Bone follows a predictable stress-strain story. Elastic flex, then yield, then fracture, with collagen doing the early bending and mineral taking the final hit. But that story changes shape depending on how fast you push it, which is where things get genuinely interesting. Here's the counterintuitive physics at the heart of today's topic. Hit a bone fast enough, and it actually becomes stronger and stiffer in the moment, right before it becomes far more likely to shatter. This is the difference between a slow, gradual load and a sudden impact. Slow loading gives bone time to deform plastically, absorbing energy gradually and often bending or cracking in a more contained way. Fast loading skips that gradual process almost entirely and pushes the bone towards sudden, brittle, often multi-fragment failure. The physics reason comes down to time. At low strain rates, microcracks have time to form throughout the material and dissipate energy across a wider area before anything gives way completely. At high strain rates, there simply isn't time for that same energy spreading process, so the bone reaches its failure stress with less overall strain, meaning less bending before it breaks. Laboratory testing on human cortical bone confirms this pattern precisely. As loading rate increases, the failure stress bone can withstand actually goes up, while the strain, or how much it stretches before breaking, goes down. Stronger in the instant, but with far less margin for error. Here's the full cascade in sequence. A sudden impact delivers energy faster than collagen fibers can slide and slacken. With less time for that plastic deformation, microcracks can't spread out and dissipate the load. Stress concentrates instead of distributing, and the mineral matrix reaches its breaking point in a shorter overall stretch, producing a more sudden, more fragmented failure. Compare two ways of loading the same amount of total energy into a leg bone. In a slow trip and fall, that energy gets delivered over roughly 1/10 of a second, often producing a single clean crack. In a car crash, the same energy can arrive in a few thousandths of a second, and lab studies on cortical bone consistently show this kind of high-rate loading produces more brittle, comminuted, multi-fragment fractures. This isn't a fringe idea. It's one of the most consistently replicated findings in bone biomechanics research. Multiple independent studies using techniques like the split Hopkinson bar, which can apply loads in milliseconds, have confirmed the same pattern across human and animal cortical bone, stiffer and stronger at speed, but with reduced strain to failure. This is exactly why a slow motion fall and a sudden collision at the same energy level can produce wildly different injuries. It's not just about how hard you hit, it's about how quickly the energy arrives, which is a big part of why protective gear is engineered specifically to slow that arrival down. Fast loading makes bone momentarily stronger and stiffer, but it steals away the time bone needs to deform and absorb energy, which is exactly why sudden impacts tend to produce more severe, more fragmented breaks. Quick pause. If this breakdown is helping you, take a second to hit like and subscribe. It genuinely takes a lot of effort to make videos like this, and your support keeps them coming. If bone were just brittle mineral, a single microscopic crack would run straight through it, and it would shatter constantly. It doesn't, because bone has evolved a genuine toolkit for stopping cracks in their tracks. Zoom into the microscopic structure of bone, and you'll find it's organized into cylindrical units called osteons, each wrapped in a thin, weaker boundary layer called a cement line. Far from being a design flaw, that weaker boundary is actually a deliberate crack trap. Researchers, notably materials scientist Robert Ritchie's lab, identified two dominant mechanisms bone uses to resist crack growth. Crack deflection happens when a growing crack hits one of those cement lines and gets redirected sideways instead of punching straight through. Crack bridging happens when tough collagen fibrils span across a crack's open faces, physically holding the two sides together and resisting further opening. These mechanisms measurably work. Fracture toughness testing on human cortical bone shows resistance actually rising as a crack grows longer, called a rising R curve, direct evidence that these crack-stopping mechanisms are actively kicking in and getting more effective as damage accumulates. Altogether, bone stacks up several distinct crack-stopping tricks at different size scales, from molecules sliding past each other, up to whole cracks getting physically redirected. It's this layered defense system that lets bone tolerate constant microscopic damage without falling apart. Myth: a bone either holds together or instantly shatters the moment it's overloaded. Fact: real fracture is a process, not an instant event. Cracks initiate, get slowed or redirected by these defenses, and only complete the break once the applied stress overwhelms every one of those mechanisms at once. One more detail worth knowing. These same crack-stopping mechanisms are exactly what deteriorate with age, which we'll get to shortly. If you're enjoying this deep dive, a like helps this kind of content reach more people. Bone isn't just tough by luck. It actively fights back against cracks using deflection at cement lines and bridging by collagen fibers, a genuine layered defense system built into its structure. When every crack-stopping mechanism finally gets overwhelmed, the resulting break isn't random. The shape of the fracture actually encodes the physics of exactly how it happened. A twisting force tends to produce a spiral fracture, coiling around the bone like a corkscrew. A direct bending force tends to produce a transverse or oblique fracture, cutting straight or diagonally across. And a high-energy, high-speed impact tends to produce a comminuted fracture, shattering the bone into multiple fragments rather than one clean break. A motorcyclist involved in a high-speed collision presents with a badly fragmented femur fracture on imaging, multiple bone pieces rather than a clean break. Given everything we've covered, this comminuted pattern is exactly what the physics predicts. Enormous energy delivered in an extremely short window of time, well past what any of bone's crack-stopping mechanisms could contain. Kids' bones actually tell a different physics story entirely. A child's bone has a higher proportion of collagen relative to mineral, so instead of snapping completely, it often bends and partially cracks on just one side, called a greenstick fracture, named for how a young, green tree branch bends and splinters rather than snapping clean through. Certain locations break more often than others simply because of how we tend to fall and brace. The wrist takes the brunt of an outstretched hand fall, the hip absorbs a direct sideways fall, and the ankle twists under a rotational load, each site reflecting a slightly different loading pattern. Among all fragility-related fractures, a striking pattern shows up in the data. Wrist, hip, and spine fractures dominate the statistics, largely because these are the sites that bear the brunt of typical falls, and because they contain a higher proportion of the more fracture-prone trabecular, honeycomb-style bone. The physics doesn't stop mattering once the bone actually breaks, either. How a fracture heals depends heavily on how it broke. A comminuted, high-energy fracture carries a higher risk of delayed healing or non-union, since there's simply less stable bone-to-bone contact for new tissue to bridge across. A fracture pattern is a physics fingerprint of the impact that caused it. A twist leaves a spiral, a bend leaves a clean break, and a high-speed collision leaves fragments, each one telling the exact story of how the energy arrived. Here's a sobering physics reality. The exact same fall that would barely bruise a 20-year-old can shatter a hip in someone in their 80s, and the reason traces directly back to everything we've just covered. Both bone stiffness and, even more sharply, bone's capacity to absorb energy before fracturing declines steadily with age, largely driven by a shrinking strain to failure. In plain terms, older bones simply can't bend as far before it gives way, which is exactly the toughness margin we spent this whole video explaining. Osteoporosis accelerates this same underlying physics problem. The normal balance between bone building and bone breakdown cells shifts toward net loss, mineral density drops. The trabecular honeycomb structure thins and develops holes, and the whole structure ends up with dramatically less material available to absorb an impact. The real-world scale of this is enormous. Hip fractures alone affect millions of older adults worldwide every year, and research consistently shows that more than 95% of them are triggered by a fall, most often a simple sideways fall directly onto the hip. It's worth knowing what actually raises fall risk in the first place, since preventing the fall is just as important as strengthening the bone. Balance and muscle strength decline with age, vision changes make hazards harder to spot, and certain medications can affect coordination or blood pressure on standing. The genuinely encouraging news: several of the physics-relevant risk factors here are modifiable. Weight-bearing exercise can slow bone loss. Balance training reduces fall risk directly, and adequate calcium and vitamin D support the mineral side of the equation we've spent this whole video discussing. Doctors can actually measure this physics decline directly using a DEXA scan, a low-dose X-ray technique that estimates bone mineral density and flags people whose bone has thinned enough to be at meaningfully higher fracture risk, well before any fall ever happens. Aging bone loses both stiffness and, more sharply, its energy-absorbing toughness, which is exactly why a low-energy fall that would be harmless at 20 can become a serious fracture decades later. Let's bring the whole picture together. Here are the 5 physics ideas worth carrying with you the next time you think about a bone breaking. Here's a simple way to lock it in. Remember the word SNAP. Speed of loading changes everything. Nanoscale mineral and collagen work as a team. Absorption of energy is the real question, not just strength, and protective structures like crack bridging fight back until they're overwhelmed. Quick check before we close. Based on everything we've covered, why does a car crash tend to produce a more shattered, comminuted fracture than a slow trip and fall carrying the same total energy? It's worth being honest about what this physics framework explains well and where it has limits. It reliably predicts general fracture patterns and why speed matters so much, but it can't account for every individual variation. Genetics, hydration, prior micro-damage, and bone geometry all shift the exact numbers from person to person. This physics has a genuinely practical payoff. It's exactly why helmets, padding, and crumple zones work. By extending the time over which an impact's energy is absorbed, they lower the effective strain rate delivered to your bones, keeping the impact in the more forgiving, energy-absorbing part of the stress-strain story instead of the brittle, high-speed regime. So here's the short, practical version of everything we've covered, where the padding, respect that speed matters more than raw force alone, and remember that bone health, especially exercise and mineral intake, is really about protecting that energy-absorbing toughness margin over the long run. So, in plain terms, one final time. A bone fracture happens when the mechanical stress delivered by an impact exceeds what bone's mineral-collagen composite structure can absorb and redirect in the time available. And that available time, driven by impact speed, is the hidden variable behind the whole story. The next time you hear about a bone breaking, remember it was never just about force. It was about how fast that force arrived, and whether bone's remarkable, living architecture had enough time to fight back. Here are the key references and sources for this video. Thanks so much for watching. If this helped, like the video and subscribe for more clear, simple explainers, and I'll see you in the next one.